The day Mexico went bankrupt. Welcome back. In 1982, the world woke up to an announcement that sent shockwave through global finance. Mexico, one of the largest economies in Latin America, had run out of money. Not metaphorically, literally. The country's foreign reserves were empty, and it could no longer pay the interest on its $80 billion external debt. To put that into perspective, Mexico owed more money than the combined GDP of many African nations at the time. International banks trembled, oil markets quivered, and the United States feared that the collapse of its southern neighbor could spark a chain reaction across the entire global financial system. But how did Mexico, a country rich in oil and blessed with natural resources, fall into such a devastating crisis? The story is one of ambition, corruption, global greed, and the gamble of borrowing beyond limits. It all began decades earlier. Mexico in the mid-20th century was undergoing what economists called a Mexican miracle. From the 1940s through the early 1970s, the economy grew at around 6% annually, factories expanded, cities modernized, and the middle class swelled. On paper, it looked like a model of development. But beneath the shiny surface lay a fragile foundation, a political system controlled by the Institutional Revolutionary Party, PRI, which had ruled since 1929. The PRI's power was absolute, blending nationalism, populism, and crony capitalism. Corruption was rampant, and instead of investing heavily in long-term infrastructure, politicians often favored projects that won quick public approval and personal kickbacks. By the 1970s, Mexico had a stroke of luck that seemed like divine intervention. Oil. Massive reserves were discovered in the Gulf of Mexico and southern states. Suddenly, the country that had been importing energy could dream of becoming an oil giant. With prices soaring after the OPEC oil embargo of 1973, Mexico's leaders believed they had struck a golden ticket. President José López Portillo, who took office in 1976, was convinced oil would fund Mexico's future. He famously declared, "We must learn to manage abundance." But abundance is a dangerous illusion. Instead of cautiously saving revenues, Mexico embarked on a borrowing spree. International banks, flush with petrodollars recycled from oil-rich Middle Eastern states, were eager to lend. Between 1976 and 1981, Mexico's external debt ballooned from $20 billion to $80 billion. Loans funded highways, factories, public works, and also, quietly, the personal fortunes of politicians and businessmen. For a while, it worked. The economy boomed, oil exports soared, and López Portillo basked in popularity. Mexico was hailed as a rising power, a Brazil of the North. But oil, like any commodity, is a fickle master. In 1981, global oil prices collapsed, dropping from $35 a barrel to under $15. Almost overnight, Mexico's main source of income was cut in half. Yet the debt remained, and the interest payments were staggering. By mid-1982, Mexico was spending more on debt service than it was earning from exports. To make matters worse, U.S. interest rates were skyrocketing as the Federal Reserve, under Paul Volcker, tried to tame inflation. Loans that once seemed manageable now carried crushing costs. The breaking point came on August 12, 1982. Finance Minister Jesus Silva Herzog stunned Wall Street by announcing that Mexico could no longer meet its debt obligations. The country needed an immediate restructuring and billions in emergency loans to avoid total collapse. In that moment, the illusion of the Mexican miracle shattered. Mexico had gone bankrupt. The ripple effects were immediate. International banks, especially in the U.S., panicked. Major institutions like Citibank, Chase Manhattan, and Bank of America had lent billions to Mexico. If the country defaulted, it could trigger bank failures in the United States. This was not just a Mexican problem. It was a global crisis. Within days, the U.S. government and the International Monetary Fund, IMF, scrambled to organize a rescue package. Mexico received $4 billion in emergency loans, but they came with harsh conditions: austerity, spending cuts, devaluation of the peso, and sweeping reforms. For ordinary Mexicans, the pain was brutal. Inflation soared to triple digits, wages stagnated, unemployment rose, and the peso collapsed, wiping out savings. A middle class that had believed in the promise of progress suddenly slid into poverty. In Mexico City, protests erupted, and anger boiled against both the government and the foreign bankers who seemed to dictate national policy. The PRI's legitimacy cracked, though it would cling to power for another 2 decades. But here's where the story gets even more suspenseful. Mexico's bankruptcy was only the beginning. The 1982 crisis unleashed a domino effect across Latin America. Brazil, Argentina, Chile, and dozens of other countries that had also borrowed heavily from Western banks found themselves unable to pay. A decade of prosperity turned into what historians call La Década Perdida, the lost decade. From 1982 through the early 1990s, Latin America was trapped in a cycle of debt, austerity, and stagnation. Growth flatlined, poverty deepened, and an entire generation saw its hopes dim. Mexico, however, became a laboratory for international finance. The IMF and World Bank pushed a model of neoliberal reform, privatization of state industries, liberalization of trade, and deregulation. The Mexican state, once heavily involved in the economy, began retreating. Industries from telecommunications to banking were sold off, often to politically connected elites. This was the era when figures like Carlos Slim began building fortunes, buying privatized assets at bargain prices. In a cruel twist, Mexico's bankruptcy indirectly created new billionaires. President López Portillo, who had once promised abundance, left office disgraced. In his final speech in 1982, he wept before Congress, declaring, "I will defend the peso like a dog." But he had failed. The peso was devalued, his credibility shattered. Mexicans remembered him less as a leader of a miracle than as the man who presided over its collapse. And yet, the crisis forced changes that reshaped Mexico's future. Out of the ashes of bankruptcy came a slow integration with global markets. By the 1990s, under President Carlos Salinas, Mexico joined NAFTA, tying its economy to the United States and Canada. The scars of 1982 never fully healed, but the lessons of that collapse haunted Mexican policymakers for decades. Every president since has been wary of excessive borrowing, knowing that international creditors have long memories. Looking back, the day Mexico went bankrupt wasn't just about numbers on a balance sheet. It was about the fragility of economic dreams built on volatile resources, about the arrogance of politicians who mistook oil wealth for endless prosperity, and about the ruthless logic of global finance, which can elevate a nation one year and crush it the next. The legacy of 1982 is still felt today. On the one hand, it taught Mexico discipline. Its modern financial system is more resilient, its central bank more independent, and its debt management far more cautious. On the other hand, it left deep skepticism about globalization and foreign lenders. For millions of Mexicans, IMF remains a dirty word, synonymous with hardship and austerity. So what's the real lesson here? That wealth built on debt is fragile. That natural resources, no matter how abundant, can betray you if you treat them as infinite. And that when nations borrow, they also cede a measure of sovereignty. On August 12, 1982, Mexico discovered that financial independence is as important as political independence. In the end, the day Mexico went bankrupt wasn't just a national humiliation, it was a global turning point. It reshaped the world's understanding of debt, forced international institutions into new roles, and left a cautionary tale for every country that dreams too big, too fast. If you enjoyed this story, leave $1 in the comments.